Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about the panic designing that was seen in World War II Germany towards the end of the war. We're jumping right into it today, largely because I couldn't think of a broad topic to start with before I then seamlessly segue into a more specific topic. So, as German fortunes began to reverse, with failures on the Eastern Front and Soviet gains, the loss of North Africa to Allied forces in 1943, and an Allied invasion to the north through France, Germany found itself fighting effectively a three-front war, one front more than they really wanted to avoid in a two-front war. And as the losses began to pile up, and as their resources and manpower would dwindle, Germany would grow increasingly desperate. This would lead to a metaphorical shotgun blast of new weapon ideas, supposed superweapons, that would really help Germany turn the tide of the war and halt Allied advances and attacks. Now, even before this shotgun blast of ideas, Germany was certainly no stranger to superweapons, these incredibly powerful pieces of equipment that were also largely more ridiculous than war-winning, like the Sherwood Gustav railway cannon and the Panzer Maus, two very powerful weapons, certainly, but also two incredibly impractical weapons, as the railway cannon needed special rail tracks and much more to function properly, while the Maus was way too big to be anything more than a very slightly mobile turret. Outside of these projects, a lot of wild superweapon ideas early on in the war remain just that, ideas, interesting concepts that were eventually passed on in favor of more practical projects. But as the tide of war shifted and once almighty German armor and aircraft would fall to enemy fire more and more, and it seemed like the more normal designs just weren't working anymore, anything became fair game. From the more understandable projects like the Mistel planes that would take old airframes and turn them into bombs, to the more fanciful and dangerous ideas like the Natter, that was basically a manned rocket with a nose full of bottle rockets. Anything that could potentially stem the Allied advances was given extra attention, time, and resources. One of the bigger issues that was given a lot of attention and focus was the presence of Allied bombers and their escort aircraft over German-controlled territory. While Germany did still have some solid conventional aircraft as the tide of war shifted, one area they were lacking a bit in was a solid performing interceptor, aircraft that would be more vital in a defensive conflict that they now found themselves in. From this need came a few strange designs, like the previously mentioned Natter, along with the ME-163 and the BV-155, to name a few, with the BV-155 being comparatively normal looking, albeit with a very wide wingspan. All three of these designs, though, were not very successful for different reasons, with the BV-155 appearing too late in the war, and thus never even having a completed prototype. The ME-163 was just too troublesome and finicky and prone to exploding, and the Natter was just honestly kind of stupid. Our subject for today belongs in this group in that it wasn't very successful, but for all intents and purposes it was also a very promising sort of superplane that suffered from a lack of time and also a lack of testing. This is a plane that was just about forced into production. This is the Focke Wulf Ta-152. For this sort of superplane, we'll start with one of Germany's best aircraft in the Focke Wulf Fw-190, a single-engine monoplane fighter. While basically being the little brother of the Bf-109, from the standpoint of production numbers anyway, the Fw-190 was arguably the better of the two aircraft, and probably one of the best fighters of the entire war, combining a relatively small frame with an engine that was originally designed for far larger bomber and transport planes in the BMW 801. The FW-190 offered great speed, great maneuverability, and generally speaking, a better armament than the BF-109. Introduced in August 1941, the FW-190 and BF-109 would make for a powerful duo for the Luftwaffe, and both aircraft would be a significant reason for some of the early successes of Germany in the first half of the war. Even with the very solid performance of both planes, there was an area that both of them didn't perform all that well at, and that was at high altitudes. Below roughly 20,000 feet, both planes performed exceptionally well. Above that altitude, though, both planes' engines were simply not equipped for high-altitude, high-speed performance, which meant that if Allied forces were eventually going to be using high-altitude aircraft, Germany didn't really have the fighters that were capable of stopping them. Still, in the first half of the war, this wasn't really a problem, and the Allied forces had to focus far more on defense than offense, and the bulk of their focus would be on halting the German advance and attempting to gain air superiority in the first place, rather than sending over wave after wave of high-altitude bomber or high-altitude escort. Regardless, though, while not a problem yet early on in the war, the Luftwaffe and Reich Air Ministry did acknowledge that it was a weakness, so they would begin testing some FW-190s with different turbocharged engines that would hopefully give it better performance at high altitudes. So from the mainline FW-190A line, a handful of these frames would be taken and modified for testing. One of them would have a modified BMW 801 engine and would be given the name of FW-190B. One of them would have a Daimler-Benz DB603 installed, and it was given the name FW-190C, and one of them would have a Junkers Umo 213, and the name of FW-190D. This group of 3 test aircraft would rather quickly be reduced to a group of 2, as the B model would not show all that much improvement over the baseline, and so it was determined that the BMW 801 engine just didn't have all that much room to grow on the FW-190 frame. On the C and D variant planes, they would have inline engines, and normally this would necessitate some significant alterations to the fuselage and nose. Normally, this would mean that radiators would be installed somewhere on the fuselage or in the wings. But as a simpler solution, the C and D models would utilize annular radiators that effectively made the inline engines look like radial engines. The addition of this annular radiator, along with the increased weight of the engines used, meant that the nose and tail of the C and D model had to be extended in order to maintain proper center of gravity. Basically, the C and D models became stretched-out versions of the baseline FW-190, some sort of doppelgangers that looked a little bit weird. Now down to these 2 aircraft and these 2 engines, the original designer of the FW-190, Kurt Tank, seemed to root for the C variant and its DB603 engine, and he apparently had his heart set on the DB603 for his future fighter designs, because it was the larger, dimensionally speaking, of the 2 engines, and it would presumably offer greater potential as a result. In the initial testing of the C and D variants, both of them showed excellent promise, achieving top speeds above 20,000 feet, well over 400 miles an hour. But ultimately, even though Tank liked the C variant and the DB603 engine more, the Luftwaffe and Air Ministry preferred the D model and the Umo 213. This was because, A, the DB603 was having many more issues with engine failures and just general growing pains, and B, factories were already being set up to produce the UMO-213, so more of those engines could be produced over the DB603. So inevitably, the FW190D model was selected for further production. But as Tank had his heart set on the DB603, he was very dismissive of the FW190D model as a whole. Tank would openly view it as being a sort of bridge aircraft, until the DB603 engine was ready, or until a proper, uniquely designed, high-performing, high-altitude fighter could be made. The 190D was a slapped-together transitionary plane. Despite being so looked down upon by its creator, the FW190D was probably the peak of the entire FW190 lineage. While Tank openly talked poorly of the plane, and that made many a pilot initially dislike it before even flying it, that dislike quickly turned into adoration upon flying it for even a little bit. Pilots found that the D model had a greatly improved climb rate, acceleration rate, top speed, and even turn rate, despite the overall increase in length and weight. Many pilots fell in love with the FW190D, believing it to be one of, if not the best German fighter in their entire arsenal by the time it arrived in late 1944-ish. Still though, despite the better engine that had better high-altitude performance, the true high-altitude performance of the 190D production models didn't actually serve as a significant improvement, and as a whole the D model line was largely shifted into just being an improved FW190A. In the background of the 190D project, Tank was working on an actual high-altitude model, a plane that was effectively just a further stretched out FW190D, and if Tank had his way, this new model would, at least in some of the variants, be using the DB603 engine. Tank envisioned an all-new design in the TA-153, a plane that was effectively to be the overall successor to the FW190, sort of like what the 190D was to the 190A, but even further. However, as that design was to be quite a bit different than the FW190, and the Reich Air Ministry and the likes of Erhard Milch preferred having more streamlined and less varied production lines, the TA-153 project ended up getting rejected in early to mid-1943. Instead, while the 190D project was still ongoing, Tank and the Air Ministry would have a bit of a compromise, and the TA-152 would be born, a plane that was still similar enough to the FW-190 that it would be using the same factories and production lines. Initially, it was planned for the TA-152 to have its own varied line, to be the new successor to the FW-190, and several different variants were proposed. The most prominent variant in the end would be the TA-152H, the high-altitude fighter variant. There would also be the 152A, outfitted with a UMO-213A engine that was to serve as a standard fighter. There was also the 152B, outfitted with the UMO-213E that was to serve as a heavy fighter. Both of these aircrafts, optionally, could be fit with the DB603 if it was available. Generally speaking, though, the UMO engines would have been the primary option. And later on in 1944, another 152 model, the 152C, would be proposed as a fighter-bomber that was equipped primarily with the DB603. I assume this plane would be Tank's baby. Of the A, B, C, and H variants, the bulk of the focus would quickly be placed on the H design, due to Germany's lack of high-altitude fighters in the Luftwaffe, and also the rumored threat of Allied B-29 bombers flying and attacking at insane altitudes. While B-29s only at max flew roughly around 30,000 feet, and B-29s weren't even used in Europe against the Germans, Germany was still aware of this plane and the rumors that surrounded it. And as Allied bombing would intensify through 1944, I guess in the end, what specific model planes were attacking Germany at this point was kind of irrelevant. Germany needed high-altitude interceptors to take on bombers and their escorts. For this need, the 152H design was largely a stretched-out version of the 190D. The extended fuselage and extended length of the 190D was extended even further, out to an overall length of 10.82 meters. This length was matched by the other 152 variants as well. For the H's wingspan, that would be significantly increased by almost 50%, up to 14.44 meters. This compared to the roughly 11-meter wingspan of the other TA-152 variants. This major increase in wingspan on the H was solely because of its high-altitude role, as the greater wingspan would increase performance and control at high altitude. Conversely, though, it would also decrease performance at lower altitudes due to the increase in drag and just sort of general size. However, it appears that Germany did have a plan for this, and on all of the 152 models, they would be equipped with some kind of booster, either an MW50 methanol and water injection system or a GM1 nitrous injection system. The MW50 would be utilized for boosting power at low altitude, and the GM1 at high altitude. On the A, B, and C variants, it appears as though only one of the two injectors was to be installed, and on the H variant it was planned for both of them to be installed, for the MW50 to make up for the decrease in performance at low altitude, and for the GM1 to further boost performance at high altitude. For the proposed armament of these planes, all of the models would vary a bit according to their intended role. The A and C models, to be the standard fighter and fighter-bomber respectively, would largely share the same basic armament, of one centrally mounted firing through the engine MK-108 or MK-103 30mm cannon. There would also be a pair of MG-151 20mm cannons in the fuselage, and a pair of the same in the wings. Optionally, on the 152A, there could be two additional cannons, either 20 or 30mm, also located in the wings. Both of them could also be optionally fit with 1,100 pounds of explosives. For the B model heavy fighter, there would be just 3 guns, but all of them were guaranteed to be 30mm cannons, one firing centrally, 2 in the wings, along with the potential 1,100-pound bomb load. For the 152H, as the weight would have to be reduced a bit to increase fuel capacity and improve high-altitude performance, the armament would be the weakest of the bunch, with one 30mm cannon firing centrally and two 20mm cannons in the wings. As it was a high-altitude fighter, it would not have the ability to carry explosives, but it would be able to carry an under-fuselage drop tank if needed to increase the range. Sticking with the 152H here due to its role, it would also have some more unique features that the other models wouldn't have. 2 unique design differences would be an enlarged vertical tail surface and a pressurized cockpit. While all of the 152s would have a slightly larger tail section, larger from the FW190 anyway, the H would have a bigger vertical surface, for high-altitude stability reasons. For the pressurized cockpit, an air compressor was attached to the engine and would take in air from a scoop by the radiator. The air would be filtered, and above an altitude of around 26,000 feet, the compressor would activate, simultaneously closing a release valve and maintaining a constant pressure in the cockpit, roughly 0.37 atmospheres or 0.37 atm. 0.37 atm is roughly the atmospheric pressure at 26,000 feet. So basically, above 26,000 feet, the pilot would continue experiencing 26,000 feet even as the plane was higher. As the need for this high-altitude fighter would grow through 1944, the 152H would be rushed into prototype production. In December 1943, Focke Wulf projected that these prototypes would not be ready until at least August 1944, but by July 13, 1944, the first prototype was rushed into completion and would take to the air for the first time. And this first flight of the 152H would be a disastrous one, and after just 36 minutes, the first prototype would be lost. Once it was in the air, they found that one of the landing gear legs didn't lock into place properly, which meant that it couldn't really land. So when it did try to land, the plane suffered severe damage and was inevitably retired. The second prototype, first flown the next month, would fare a bit better for a little while, before then going out in an even more catastrophic fashion. Flying for over 10 hours, the second prototype would not have the landing gear issue that led to the destruction of the first, but it would have issues with the supercharging system, when some high-altitude tests were conducted. In addition to the supercharger failing to work properly at high altitude, there were also fuel pump issues as well, also failing at high altitudes. Then, after a total of 10 hours and 3 minutes of flight time, the second prototype's engine caught fire mid-air, and then proceeded to crash while the pilot tried to land so they could put out the fire. The plane was completely destroyed, and the test pilot was killed in the process. The next two prototypes would see more success in that they didn't crash, but the overall results from the testing wasn't great. There were still issues with the supercharging system, the stability was poor, and the stall characteristics weren't great. Additionally, while it was planned for the production model planes to have both the low and high altitude boosters, along with some additional fuel tanks, they hadn't actually figured out how to have all of these features on the same plane running on the same engine. Hypothetically, they could, but they didn't know how yet. As prototype testing would continue into late 1944, by November, Focke Wulf made and delivered 20 pre-production models for inspection and testing. As Germany was desperate, even though the 152H prototypes weren't exactly good yet, Focke Wulf would be ordered to go ahead with full-scale production anyway. When production began, the 4 total prototypes, not including the 20 pre-production models, had a combined total flight time of about 31 hours. By the time the first production model 152s arrived to their units, in late January 1945, total flight time across all aircraft was just about 50 hours. Despite not performing terribly well overall as a prototype, the 152H did showcase incredible speed and a very high service ceiling. The top speed was upwards of 472 miles an hour, and the highest altitude reached was 44,796 feet, about 50% higher than the B-29 that Germany was afraid of. With this performance, the 152H had some of the best specs on paper of any German aircraft in World War II, and some of the best specs of any propeller-powered plane in the war. But with this incredible potential, Germany would never be able to fully capitalize. In a vacuum, the 152H would be a formidable foe, with low-altitude performance that roughly was on par with the FW-190. In a direct one-to-one comparison, the 152H just about matched the performance of the best Allied fighters. But the big problem for the 152H was that there simply wasn't enough of them. Under increasing duress from Allied attacks and the need to put out other fighters for the defense of Germany, there weren't enough resources to go around. And all said and done, it's safe to say that under 100 152s were made in total, likely somewhere between 60 and 70 of them, although some sources do list the total production being over 150, and some also list the production being as low as just 12. But being so few in number overall, their combat record would be pretty minimal as well, with just a handful, maybe two handfuls of enemy takedowns for a handful of losses of their own. Funnily enough, the TA-152 apparently never actually flew a high-altitude mission, and instead it just stuck to middle and low altitudes, so really what was even the point of the entire project? As for the rest of the 152 variants, the A, B, and C, it's likely that just a few or maybe even none of these planes were ever even made, with production focusing on the H variant and the previous FW-190. So ultimately the 152's legacy is a bit of a weird one. While it was certainly a high-performing plane, and those that flew the production model actually spoke pretty well of it, so apparently the stability issues just went away, forcing it into production was ultimately a fruitless endeavor. As it was never used in its high-altitude role, the Luftwaffe would almost certainly have been better focusing wholly on the FW-190, and specifically the D variant. Its performance was great, and it was using the UMO-213 as well. But Germany was panicking. They wanted some kind of superweapon that was going to turn the tide of the war. They wanted something to destroy those B-29s that weren't actually overhead. When the walls are closing in and the end is near, you probably aren't going to be thinking very rationally, and they weren't. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. German late war designs are easily some of the most interesting aircraft ever conceptualized. Seems like out of sheer panic and desperation, designers are just scrambling to find something that'll work and get approved. Like, slap a jet engine on a cardboard box, we've got our new bomber destroyer, they'll never see it coming. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.